You're listening to the Empowered Divorce Podcast, where you practice being the chooser in your life again, one day at a time. Thanks for joining me. Hello, my amazing, beautiful listeners. How are you? Thank you for joining me today. I'm recording this episode as a follow-up to the episode that I just recorded with my husband, Scott. The conversation that we were having around when to share your story, when to talk about your trauma, when you're dating. And one of the things that I was reflecting on after our conversation was vulnerability. I wanted to speak today about vulnerability and really validate how that vulnerability has been impacted because of betrayal and due to the abusive behaviors and communication that happen to hide the betrayal that your partner, whatever that betrayal consisted of, there was some hiding, there was some deceiving, deflecting. So gaslighting is one of those abusive behaviors that kept you from the reality, that kept you from truth, right? When we are unaware of what's happening and we continue to bond, so we're adapting our central nervous system and continuing to bond to our partner in this false reality, it absolutely impacts your inherent vulnerability, sensitivity, and intuition. So I want to talk about vulnerability specifically today. It's funny because I was thinking about this and I was like, oh, I'm going to record an episode. I want to talk about this. My first thought was, who am I to talk about vulnerability? Because when I think about vulnerability, I don't know about y'all, but when I think about this topic, I think about the one and the only Brene Brown and how she talks and teaches about this principle of vulnerability so well. I had to laugh at myself because it made me not want to be vulnerable and get on here and record an episode because I was like, there's no way little old me can talk about vulnerability. And what I do feel like I have to offer here that is different is that perspective, talking about vulnerability through the lens of someone that has experienced betrayal, abuse, and a life-saving divorce. So I'm hoping that it still offers some value, but I will absolutely recommend going and reading some of Brene Brown's literature, some of her books that she has written around vulnerability. It's so applicable to relationships. She's got some amazing books out there. Braving the Wilderness is a good one. The Gifts of Imperfect Parenting is a really good one. Men, Women, and Worthiness. I'm not going to even attempt to go any further in this episode without referencing her incredible work. It is absolutely life-changing. But I also know that there is space that she hasn't fully stepped into, vulnerability after betrayal and abuse. And so that's where hopefully I can come in and offer some additional thoughts. But I just thought it was funny that here I am publishing an episode on vulnerability and being vulnerable. And immediately I was like, wait a second, I can't do that. So I think where I like starting oftentimes when we're talking about something as widespread, large, big, and impactful as vulnerability is, what's the principle? What's the underlying principle or foundational truth around vulnerability? This does go back to a lot of Brené's core teachings, where vulnerability is not a weakness. It is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. And yet vulnerability is also uncertainty. Vulnerability is risk. We are risking rejection. We are risking emotional exposure. And so betrayal trauma, all three of what I just mentioned are violated. Certainty, violation. Safety, violated. Emotional intimacy, blindsided. So it makes sense why coming out of a relationship like this, vulnerability feels like a weakness because you leaned into vulnerability. You showed up in that relationship vulnerable and was taken advantage of. And sometimes parts of us, the human brain, can flip that around and use it against ourselves. And it feels like we are weak, or it was a weakness to be that vulnerable. I remember thinking, never again, right? Never again am I going to let myself be that vulnerable or that trusting, because the result was injury when it's so unfathomable to wrap your head around how how another human being can do this kind of a thing to another human being. When your brain cannot figure that out, it's going to do what it knows, and that's to turn against you. So it makes sense, although it's not correct or even nice for the brain to do this, but it makes sense that it is going to then protect you by saying, don't ever do that again. That's weak. That brings pain. That brings harm. Betrayal damages your ability to be vulnerable. We have vulnerability shock. This is the moment that you realize someone exploited your deepest openness, that the betrayal wasn't just betrayal of trust. It was an absolute violation of the space that you were brave enough to open up in. So we have vulnerability shock, the shock that comes when you realize, wait, I'm showing up vulnerable. I'm putting myself out there. And now I'm realizing that my person wasn't. They really aren't being as vulnerable as I was. There is literal shock around this moment. And that's the shock that you've heard me talk about that gets stuck in our body. Shock comes before fight, flight, freeze, fawn, trauma response. And that shock can get stuck physiologically in the body. This is where the Alexander technique has come in to help my clients, where we release that shock so that we can process more of that stored affect or emotional response. But vulnerability shock, another way that I see betrayal damage vulnerability is it now creates vulnerability hesitation. So anytime you have an opportunity to be vulnerable with someone, no matter who it is, family, friends, and those of you who are dating again and trying to put yourself back out there, some of you are going to feel the vulnerability hesitation. And that internal freeze happens when someone comes along, they are safe, but your body says, no, I've done this before and it nearly destroyed me. We're not doing that again. Betrayal also creates vulnerability hangover, where you do start sharing. You start sharing something real. Even if you share and the space is healthy and the person responds in a healthy way, you might wake up with the shame spiral or the fear, because now it's like, did I say too much? Should I do too much? Am I too much? Did I make a mistake opening up again? Because you don't want to get hurt again. That part of you is showing up to protect. When someone has weaponized your vulnerability, it's not weakness to protect it, it's wisdom. But healing means learning to let the right people in, not just keeping everybody out. I also see betrayal and abuse impact vulnerability, where we can now have too much vulnerability or too little. So let me explain. Too much, and some of you might be like, too much vulnerability, is that even a thing? It is a thing, because it is going back to what I was talking about with Scott, that wise femininity. It's impacted that trifecta, the vulnerability, sensitivity, and intuition. So oversharing is a trauma response, wanting to be seen, but doing so from a wounded place where we don't have safety and we don't have boundaries. So we're just putting ourselves out there. And I see this a lot where people will just say, this is just who I am. I just put myself out there and say la vie, whatever. But we're putting ourselves in situations to be harmed or injured or taken advantage of, because again, oversharing is a trauma response. And it is not in balance with that trifecta, with the safety, sensing the safety around you, or using your intuition to tell if this person is safe or not. Too little vulnerability is emotional self-abandonment. We are wearing armor 24/7. We are performing strength instead of living in that authenticity space. And so we wall off, we block off. We're armoring against any possible impact because of those protectors are trying to guard. Parts of us might use vulnerability as currency, right? Hoping to earn closeness, and other parts are withholding it entirely, believing that we're better off alone, safer, alone. So what does healthy look like when you've had all of this impact and all of this experience? Where do we start? Where do we begin? What would that even look like? I think it's important to recognize that you don't owe your entire story to everybody. So, kind of going back to the conversation that I had with Scott, where we were answering that question that comes up a lot, especially when we're back into dating. When do I share my story, my trauma, my experience? And how much do I share? I think it's important to start with accepting that you don't owe your whole story to everyone. Now, when you're dating, it's starting to become serious. Both parties absolutely need to be vulnerable and share all information about ourselves so that we give the other person full conscious choice to choose into that space or not. This is why I was saying it does matter, I think, first, second, third date. But if we're starting to cultivate levels of intimacy with someone and we are in a relationship with someone, then the vulnerability and the level of vulnerability does shift. Let's just start with this idea that you don't owe your whole story to everyone. And it's okay to share selectively right now in earned spaces, not out of fear or desperation, even. Vulnerability after betrayal requires those boundaries. That might seem like opposites. Vulnerability and boundaries, they can seem like, wait a second, lean in, but boundary, they actually require each other. Vulnerability without boundaries, like I said, becomes oversharing, self-betrayal, or re-traumatization. But with healthy boundaries, vulnerability becomes a choice made from your core higher capital S self, not a cry for rescue or from that fear-based part of you that doesn't want to get hurt again. Let me just give you a couple examples. I can imagine some of you are like, but what would a boundary even look like around this? So the first thing that comes to my mind is this emotional discernment. Again, not everyone has earned the right to hear your story. I think Brene even says that. So the boundary is I get to decide who receives my truth based on their safety, not just their availability. I'm going to say that one again. Not everybody has earned the right to hear your story. So you get to decide who receives your truth based on their safety from their behaviors consistently over time, not just their availability. The other thing that comes to mind with boundaries, with vulnerability, is pacing and timing. I think Scott said that a lot in that last episode. Timing really does matter. Vulnerability is not a race to connection. And sometimes I see my clients do that, especially the anxious attachment style can create a little bit of that race to connect. So a healthy boundary here is when you allow yourself time to feel, time to feel into whether this is a safe moment to share, or if you need to see more of those behaviors that cultivate trust. So your pacing and timing around vulnerability is a healthy boundary. Sometimes we share to be validated instead of witnessed, being mindful that you're not sharing from that place of needing someone to fix you, to rescue you, or to tell you that you're okay. That would not be boundary. That would not be coming from a healthy space. We've got to have that inner alignment. Vulnerability has to align with that higher wise capital S self, not from the protector part, not from the part that is afraid of being hurt again. And it's either over sharing, right? That over vulnerability, or walling off and not being vulnerable at all. The good boundary for yourself here is just pausing, taking moments in your experiences with other people to pause and to check in. Am I grounded in my body and my truth here before I open up? I also think that there's some mutuality here around vulnerability. I think true vulnerability thrives in reciprocity. If you're finding yourself being the only one that's vulnerable in that relationship, where you are constantly opening up, and maybe this is a gift, maybe this is something that isn't hard for you. right? To be vulnerable. But if you're the only one in that relationship being vulnerable, then it's requiring a boundary. Because when we go back to what real healthy connection looks like, it's two people being vulnerable. It's two people that are leaning into those levels of intimacy and saying, see into me, right? I'm opening myself up to see into me and into you. If I'm the only one opening myself up, opening those doors and letting someone see what's there, really, really vulnerable, even if it doesn't seem like there's rejection happening from that, if the other person standing in front of me is walled off, blocked off, those doors are closed, it is not true connection in a relationship. I think that's for those, this really is important for those of you who are dating and are in a relationship. A boundary around this, let me think, would look like or sound like, look, I'm not here in this relationship to bleed out while you stay armored. I get to expect emotional equity in this relationship. I'm not here to just continue to output vulnerability and not receive that back. Reciprocity is key in a healthy relationship, which then leads me to another point that I think is worth considering with boundaries is giving yourself permission to walk away. I think this is really important in any relationship that you're cultivating after a life-saving divorce. Because if you can't give yourself permission to walk away, what's holding you there? And usually what's holding you there is wounds, an attachment wound. We need to see that. We need to look at that. This is what dating from within is all about, not ignoring those parts of that are within you that are showing up, whether you want to look at them or not. Dating within is being able to stay connected to all of these parts of the self while you are dating. Giving yourself permission to walk away, because sharing your heart does not mean that you are obligated to stay in the space that invalidates it. I kind of want to say that one again. That flew out of my mouth and that sounded really good. Do you ever have those moments? I have those moments all the time. Okay. You want to give yourself permission to walk away, because sharing, now let's see if I can remember it, right? Sharing your heart, opening up, being vulnerable, which is a beautiful, brave thing. It does not mean that you are now obligated to stay in a space where that space invalidates your vulnerability. The boundary here is, if I am not honored for being vulnerable, then I reserve the right to withdraw and care for myself. Y'all, this is so important. I really hope you're hearing me on this one, because your vulnerability was not cared for in your previous relationship. I don't care how good looking or nice, kind, and all the cool things that are happening. If this vulnerability, this space, if you showing up so bravely is not being honored, why are we there? You really got to ask yourself that. Holding yourself first is so important. Dating yourself first, being with yourself, healing yourself first is so important. Before you give your vulnerability to someone else, before you open that door, open that space and say, see into me, intimacy, can you hold that for yourself? That's why I created that intimacy within course, because it's so critical for you to develop that within first. I remember having this written on my mirror to remind myself when I took my little hiatus from dating and realized I needed to do some more healing before I dated again. This was my own boundary. I will not abandon myself after I am vulnerable. After I open myself up, and let's say there is rejection or it is not received or I realize it is not safe, I'm not going to abandon myself. If I start to feel some regret for being vulnerable and opening myself up and getting into a relationship and gosh dang it, got a little far, I will meet myself with compassion first. Because what I see oftentimes when this shows up is that we are very quick to reject ourselves first, and it adds to the impact of someone rejecting us. It creates suffering. Rejection hurts, but the worst rejection is the kind that we often unconsciously do to ourselves. What does that look like? That looks like you dismissing your own feelings before anybody else can. It's probably not a big deal. How many of you find yourself saying that? I'm just going to dismiss that. It's probably not a big deal. This is that protective attempt to soften your truth before it ever hits someone else's ears, rejecting your pain in real time to avoid potential invalidation from somebody else. So you're dismissing your own feelings or apologizing for having needs, apologizing for having emotions. How many of us do this? Sorry, I don't want to be too much. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much space. In fact, it was really interesting. I just did this Body Awakened intensive, right? With 6 incredibly amazing, powerful, now very changed women that are absolutely going to change the world. It was such an amazing intensive, y'all. Oh my gosh. I'm definitely doing another one. So be on the lookout for that. But it was really interesting because the majority of the women that showed up right at the very first day, that was the message that was coming out. It was a lot of apologizing for being too much, not wanting to be too much, not wanting to take up space. This is such a common space for a lot of women to be in, where we're apologizing for having a need, for taking up space, for having emotions, for having opinions, thoughts, ideas. Good hell. I wish to high heaven we can all knock this off and take up the freaking space. When you say, sorry, I don't want to be too much, and you preemptively apologize, it's self-rejection, dressed up as politeness, by the way. It's like saying, if I know I'm inconvenient, let me just shrink a little bit more for you. Gosh, I wish we would stop doing this as women. On the opposite, I see not sharing at all and putting up those walls, even when it is safe, avoiding vulnerability completely, even with safe people, because the wounded part of you says they'll leave if they really know me. They're just going to leave. They're just going to abandon. They're just going to reject. That's a self-rejection of your truth in the name of safety. It still costs you real connection. It's still costing you real connection because the paradox of vulnerability is that you need to risk rejection in order to be completely open and vulnerable. That into me see from other people, we have to be willing to risk rejection. But what I'm offering you here is to not start this whole thing off by self-rejecting first. When you silence, when you shrink, when you soften your truth in fear that that who you are is too much or not enough or somehow wrong. Healthy vulnerability says you get to be seen, you get to be messy, you get to heal, you get to be in progress, not perfect. So let's start practicing. Let's start practicing leaning into healthy vulnerability. And you can do that by journaling, owning your story, clarifying what's yours. This really matters because after betrayal, your nervous system is often going to be in that protect or please mode, like I've been talking about, whether we are oversharing or not sharing. That can be linked to anxious attachment or avoidant, whatever you want to link that to. Either way, journaling slows down the emotional spin that can often happen, either direction, spin down or spin forward, but it lets you start to differentiate between regulated truth and the trauma-driven impulse to overshare or wall off. Asking yourself, what am I needing right now? Am I sharing right now and opening myself up to connect or to be rescued? What do I hope the outcome will be by being vulnerable? What am I hoping for here? And just being really honest with yourself about that. This is stepping into that first pillar of healing, which is awareness, because it's inviting your wise self into the room before anybody else gets into that room. The other thing you can do is start naming the part that wants to be seen. Sometimes when our abandoned and rejected parts are reaching out for connection, that's when maybe our achiever part kicks in. Maybe that's what you want to name it. Trying to prove that we're healed. I'm healed enough to date. How many of you recognize that space right now? Really trying, this is where some maybe over vulnerability can kick in. I really need to prove that I'm healed so that everybody knows I'm healed enough to date. So naming that part builds compassion and keeps you in that agent power mode rather than being overtaken by it. So if you feel the urge to trauma dump on a date, you got to pause and ask and say to yourself, hi, my lovely parts that's hoping this person can help carry me off on the white horse and rescue me from this hell. Gosh, I relate. Instead of rejecting her, this part of you, or silencing her, you're witnessing her. That's healthy internal attunement, by the way. You're creating some self-trust there. Another thing that you can do to practice vulnerability is share with people who have shown the capacity to hold space and not just proximity. A lot of you are desperate and hungry to be seen when you haven't been in so long. But not everybody is emotionally safe or equipped to hold your vulnerability. And so safety isn't about how close they show up, how often they text you or reach out or call or take you out. It's about how consistently they show up without judgment, without deflection, with empathy, without minimization of your story. Are they listening without fixing? Are they respecting your boundaries? Someone who mirrors your strength and holds space for your pain. Then another thing that you can do right now to practice vulnerability is asking yourself, is this my wise self or my wounded part? This simple yet really powerful self-reflecting question is, again, accessing that first pillar of healing with awareness. Bringing that awareness to the forefront, it's going to put the power back in your hands, because trauma can often hijack the moment of being vulnerable. And so this slows it down, helps you connect back to your body, get in your body, and then make that conscious choice rather than reacting from fear or reacting from urgency to make this relationship work, make this connection happen. You are allowed to be both protected and open. You are allowed to be cautious and courageous and brave. Healthy vulnerability knows how to hold space for both right now. And after betrayal, vulnerability might feel like you're standing barefoot in a freaking war zone. But when you heal, it becomes like you're standing barefoot in your truth. And you get to choose who you let walk beside you. You can be vulnerable and wise. You can be soft and strong. You can be open and you can be protected. Healing doesn't ask you to stay armored forever, right? It invites you to trust yourself first so that you know when and where and with whom you can be safely seen, where you can say, into me, see. That is real, healthy intimacy. But you've got to create that within you first. As always, you are the creator of your life. You are the creator of your healthy. You are the creator of how you connect with you and how you connect with other people. What you can't control is how other people show up or respond to your vulnerability. That doesn't stop or diminish the truth that you really are the creator of your life. And you get to create the life that you want because you can. Take care, everybody. Want to work with me, but you just don't have time? I get it. You want to work with me, but the funds are low? I get that too. Which is why I've created this self-paced course so that you can at least get in front of me, get some tools and concepts to help you start in your healing journey. And I think the Intimacy Within Self-Paced course is a great place to start. We talked about that last week with Scott, learning how to cultivate your own levels of intimacy. And I go through all 7 with a workbook, because I'm going to have you do some practices within each one of those levels. So head over to the show notes or amiewoolsey.com, click Intimacy Within. You'll discover how to take up space, trust your instincts, honor your emotions, connect with your higher self, and really start gaining a deeper understanding of who you are and finding who you are again and loving you more than ever before. You can start all of that today. amiewoolsey.com, Intimacy Within. Take care, everybody.